The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed on 1,000 miles of frozen prairie. It scoured the land, stripping away warmth, then hope, then the will to place one foot before the other. Snow, driven hard and horizontal, was not a gentle blanket but a swarm of icy needles that blinded her, filled her mouth, and stole the air from her lungs. Each breath was a shard of glass in her chest. The world had dissolved into a shrieking, churning vortex of white and gray, and she was at its merciless center. Her husband's coat, all she had left of him besides a memory that was beginning to feel as thin as a ghost, was a poor shield. Its worn wool was stiff with ice, a useless armor against the blizzard's siege. She stumbled, her legs numb logs of flesh and bone, and fell to her knees. The impact sent a jarring shock through her body, but the pain was distant, a faint echo from a life that was rapidly receding. She tried to rise, her gloveless fingers clawing at the deepening snow, but her muscles refused the command. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to let the cold take her, to let the white silence swallow the accusations that still rang in her ears, the looks of contempt that had burned her more than any winter wind. The town had cast her out, their judgment as swift and brutal as a hangman's noose. Jezebel, witch, bad luck. The words had followed her out into the wilderness, carried on the same wind that now promised to be her final absolution. This was what she deserved, wasn't it? To be scoured clean from the earth, forgotten. A faint, primal instinct, the last flickering ember of a fire long since banked, forced her head up. Through the maelstrom, a smudge of darkness, a trick of the failing light, of a mind surrendering to the cold, sweet lullaby. But it remained, a solid shape against the swirling chaos. A cabin. Hope was a cruel, sharp thing. It pierced the numb resignation, forcing her to move. She crawled. The motion was clumsy, pathetic, an animal dragging its broken body toward a den. Her hands were raw, her knees screaming, but the dark shape grew, resolving into the hard lines of a log structure, a thin curl of smoke torn from its stone chimney by the gale. It was a promise of life in a world determined to grant her only death. She reached the wall, the rough-hewn logs an anchor in the storm, and dragged herself along it until her hand met the solid wood of a door. She had no strength to knock, only to slump against it, her last conscious thought a prayer to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. The door opened not with a creak but a low groan, a sound of immense weight shifting. A wall of heat, thick with the scent of pine smoke and drying meat, washed over her. It was so sudden, so overwhelming, that she gasped, the warm air searing her frozen lungs. A figure filled the doorway, a silhouette against the firelight within. He was tall, broad, his form blotting out the sanctuary she had crawled toward. Fear, cold and sharp as the wind, lanced through her. She had fled the judgment of men only to deliver herself to the mercy of one. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the half-frozen creature collapsed on his threshold. She could not see his face, only the imposing shadow he cast. The silence stretched, broken only by the howl of the storm and the crackle of the fire. She expected him to shut the door, to leave her to the elements. It was what she would have done. It was what she deserved. Instead, two large, leather-gloved hands reached down. They were not gentle, but they were firm, efficient. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his grip sure on the frozen fabric of her coat. He carried her inside and kicked the door shut, plunging the world back into a muffled roar. The cabin was small, a single room dominated by a stone hearth where a fire blazed. He deposited her on the floor before it, not on the bearskin rug that lay there, but on the rough wooden planks nearby, as if she were a side of frozen beef to be thawed. He moved with a quiet economy, his steps heavy but sure on the floorboards. He was a man made of the same hard, unforgiving material as the mountains that loomed outside. He stoked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, then turned to her. In the flickering light, she finally saw his face. It was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of sun and hardship, not laughter. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls. They held no pity, no curiosity, only a flat, assessing neutrality. He saw not a woman but a problem, a complication that had washed up at his door. He left and returned with a heavy wool blanket, rough as burlap. He didn't wrap her in it. He dropped it on her. Her teeth chattered, a violent, uncontrollable rattling that shook her entire frame. He disappeared again, and the sound of an axe splitting would echoed from a lean-to at the back. He worked as if she weren't there, his focus absolute. Hours passed. The warmth began to penetrate her layers, a painful process of thawing that sent agonizing pins and needles through her limbs. She remained on the floor, a heap of wet wool and misery, watching him. He moved about the small space with a contained energy, a predator in his own domain. He checked traps, cleaned a rifle, his movements deliberate and without waste. He never spoke a word. The silence was as vast and profound as the storm outside. For Alara, who had known only whispers and shouts for months, it was a strange sort of balm. There was no judgment in his silence. There was nothing at all. And in that nothingness, she felt the first, tiny, uncurling tendril of something she had thought long dead. The simple animal desire to live. Days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a perpetual ceiling of gray cloud, but by the man's routines. He was Silas. He had said his name once, the word falling into the cabin's silence like a stone into a deep well. He asked for hers, and when she whispered Alara, he gave a single, curt nod, the exchange feeling as formal and binding as a signed contract. The storm had broken, but the world outside remained a landscape of brutalist white. The snow drifted shoulder-high against the cabin. They were marooned together on a small, wooden island in an ocean of winter. In the beginning, she was useless, a wraith haunting the edges of his world. She would sit huddled in the blanket by the fire, watching his hands. They were large, calloused, yet surprisingly deft as he mended a piece of tack or sharpened a knife. They were hands that knew work, that could force a living from this hostile land. She watched him, and she learned him, not through words, but through his rhythms. The way he rose before the first hint of light, the precise way he banked the fire at night, the almost imperceptible pause he took before stepping outside, as if bracing himself for the world's assault. He was a man who had pared his life down to the essential elements. Shelter, heat, food. There was no room for sentiment. Yet small things began to happen. One morning, a tin cup of steaming, bitter coffee was on the floor beside her when she woke. Another day, he left a bowl of stew on the small, rough-hewn table, venison and root vegetables thick and nourishing. He never handed them to her directly, never met her gaze as she took them. The offerings were simply there, factual and impersonal, like the firewood he stacked or the water he hauled. They were acts of necessity, not kindness. She told herself this repeatedly. To think otherwise was to invite a hope she could not afford to harbor. Shame was a constant, heavy cloak. She felt clumsy and weak in his presence, her own hands soft and useless by comparison. She was a burden, another mouth to feed, another complication in his solitary existence. The urge to earn her keep became a gnawing imperative. She started small. While he was out checking his trap lines, a journey from which he would return hours later rimed in ice, his beard frozen solid, she would sweep the floor with a crude broom. She tidied the small stack of books in the corner, the Bible, Shakespeare, a well-thumbed almanac. She washed the 2 bowls and spoons they used, her chapped hands stinging in the hot water she carefully ladled from the kettle. They were pitiful contributions, but they were hers. He never acknowledged her efforts. He would return, shake the snow from his coat, and the cabin would once again fill with his immense, silent presence. But she noticed that he no longer placed her food on the floor. It was left for her on the table. One afternoon, she found a tear in his heavy coat, a gash near the shoulder where it must have caught on a branch. In a small chest at the foot of her cot, a cot he had cleared for her, moving his own bedroll to the floor on the other side of the hearth, she found a small sewing kit. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy with cold and disuse, but the rhythm of the needle was familiar, a ghost of a domestic life she had once known. She mended the tear with small, neat stitches, her head bent low, the smell of pine and cold air rising from the fabric. She left the coat hanging on its peg, the repair a silent offering. That evening, when he came in, he took the coat down. He ran his thumb over the stitches. He did not look at her, but she saw the slight hesitation in the movement, an acknowledgement that passed between them in the charged silence. A week later, she woke to find a pair of mended boots by her cot. The sole of one had been pulling away, and he had stitched it back with thick, waxed thread, the work rough but strong. His strength for her weakness, her care for his. It was a language without words, a barter system of survival and, perhaps, something more. A fragile, tentative truce was being forged between them, and between Alara and the world. She began to venture outside, helping him clear pathways through the snow. The air was sharp, but cleansing. The sheer, stark beauty of the place, the snow-laden pines, the sharp blue shadows on the drifts, the immense, silent peaks in the distance, began to seep into her. It was a hard beauty, unforgiving and wild, and she felt a strange kinship with it. Here, there were no whispers, no judging eyes. There was only the snow, the wind, and the quiet, capable man who moved through it all as if he were a part of it. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, revealing a world of mud and gray slush. The isolation of the cabin began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, albeit a safe one. With the passable trails came the threat of the outside world, a world Alara had almost managed to forget. The possibility of discovery coiled in her stomach, a cold snake of dread. It was a feeling she had lived with for so long it felt like a part of her. One afternoon, while splitting kindling, a task Silas had shown her how to do, his hands briefly guiding hers on the axe handle in a moment of shocking, impersonal intimacy. She heard it. The unmistakable sound of shod hooves squelching through the mud. It was not Silas's mule. It was more than one horse. Her blood ran cold. She froze, axe in hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silas emerged from the cabin, his face unreadable, and stood on the porch. He held his rifle, not aiming it, but holding it with a casual authority that was more menacing than any overt threat. 3 riders came into the clearing. Alara recognized the man in the lead instantly. Mr. Barrow, the banker from town, the man who held the note on her and her husband's small farm. His face was fleshy and smug, his eyes small and greedy. He was flanked by 2 hired men, their expressions sullen and mean. Barrow's gaze slid past Silas and fixed on Alara, a triumphant, proprietary glint in his eyes. "Well, well, look what the winter coughed up," he said, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "We were worried about you, Alara." The whole town, the lie was so bald it choked the air. She could feel the familiar weight of their judgment settling over her again, even here, miles from their prying eyes. "She's fine," Silas said. His voice was flat, a rock against which Barrow's oily tone broke. Barrow's smile tightened. "That's my concern, not yours, friend. There are matters to be settled. She needs to come back with us." "She's staying," Silas said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, as immovable as the mountains behind them. The 2 men stared at each other across the muddy clearing. The air crackled with a tension that was almost visible. Barrow's men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving near their holsters. Barrow held up a placating hand, though his eyes remained hard. "This ain't your affair. You're harboring a woman of ill repute, a debtor who fled her obligations. You'd be wise to step aside." Silas didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle. Barrow's face flushed with anger. "We'll be back," he spat, wheeling his horse around, "and we'll have the law with us next time. You can count on it." They rode off, leaving a trail of churned mud and poisonous silence. Alara's legs gave way, and she sank onto the woodpile, the axe falling from her nerveless grasp. The fragile peace of the last few months had been shattered. She had brought her trouble, her filth, to his door. She had tainted his sanctuary. That night the fever came. It might have been the chill of the afternoon, or the terror that had finally breached her defenses, but she began to shake, a deep, racking tremor that started in her bones. She lay on the cot, curled into a tight ball, the rough blanket pulled up to her chin. The ghosts she had held at bay for so long swarmed the small cabin. She saw her husband, Thomas, his face pale and gasping for his last breath. She heard the town doctor's pronouncement. Lung fever, a bad winter's end. And then she heard the whispers that followed. That she hadn't taken proper care of him. That she'd been seen talking a little too long with the farrier. That a woman alone was an opportunity, then a temptation, then a problem. Barrow's offers of help had become demands, his visits more frequent, his eyes more hungry. She had fought him off one night, screaming and clawing, and the next day, the eviction notice had been nailed to her door. They said she was cursed, unclean. Silas was moving about the cabin, his presence a dark, solid shape in the firelit gloom. He brought her water, trying to get her to drink. She pushed it away, turning her face to the wall. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness rising in her throat. "You should have let them take me," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He didn't answer. He laid a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. The simple, human touch broke her. A sob tore from her chest. Then another. The words spilled out, a torrent of poison she had held inside for a year. "He doesn't know what I am. What they say I am." Her thoughts were a fevered jumble, spoken half to him, half to the shadows. "They said I killed him with my carelessness. That I invited Mr. Barrow's attention. They said I was spoiled. Unfit." She was weeping freely now, the tears hot on her icy cheeks. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her eyes wild in the flickering light. She looked directly at him, wanting him to see, to understand the full measure of her ruin. "I'm filthy," she confessed, the words tasting like ash. "Inside and out. I carry their dirt. I brought it here. To you." She expected him to recoil, to show some sign of the disgust she felt for herself. She expected the judgment she had seen in every other man's eyes. He just stood there, his expression as impassive as stone. Her body was racked by another wave of chills, and she pulled the blanket tighter, hiding herself. He reached forward, his large hand moving with surprising slowness. He took the edge of the rough wool blanket. Alara flinched, certain he was about to cast her out, to throw her and her filth into the night. He drew back the blanket. The firelight fell upon her, exposing her shivering form, her tear-streaked face, the raw vulnerability in her eyes. And he froze. He simply froze in silence. His gaze was fixed on her, but it was not a look of revulsion. The neutrality was gone from his eyes, replaced by an emotion she could not name. It was a stillness so profound it seemed to draw all the sound from the room. He wasn't looking at a tainted woman. He was looking at a wound. His own calloused hand, the one that could split a log or sight a rifle, lifted. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed against the mended tear on the shoulder of his coat, which hung on the peg beside him. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, he gently pulled the blanket back up, covering her to her chin. He did not speak. He simply returned to his side of the hearth, sat down in the shadows, and began to clean his rifle. But he wasn't just cleaning it. He was preparing for a war. And in his silence, Alara heard the only answer that mattered. The morning broke cold and clear, the air scrubbed clean by a night wind. A fragile truce held over the clearing, but it was the quiet of a drawn breath before a plunge. Alara felt hollowed out, scoured by the fever and the confession, but a strange calm had settled in her core. She had shown him the worst of herself, the shame she carried like a shroud, and he had not turned away. He had simply covered her back up and stood his ground. She watched him now as he moved outside, checking the sight on his rifle, pacing the perimeter of the cabin. He was no longer just a man surviving, he was a man defending. He was defending his home, and somewhere in the night, she had become part of it. The sound of riders came not long after dawn, more of them this time. Barrow was there and his 2 thugs, but they were accompanied by a man wearing a tarnished sheriff's star and 2 more grim-faced men from the town, their expressions a mixture of civic duty and morbid curiosity. They stopped at the edge of the trees, a small posse arrayed against the lone cabin. "Silas!" the sheriff called out, his voice thin in the vast landscape. "This has gone on long enough. Send the woman out. Barrow here has a legal claim." Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. "His claim is with a piece of paper, not with a person. She's not chattel. She's a debtor and a vagrant," Barrow shouted, his face purple with indignation. "She belongs to the town to see justice done." Alara, watching from the window, felt a surge of cold fury. Belongs to the town, like a stray dog or a piece of furniture. She had been their scapegoat, their cautionary tale. Now she was to be their entertainment. She looked at Silas, standing alone against them, and knew she could not let him face this for her. The woman who had crawled to his door would have stayed hidden. But she was not that woman anymore. She walked to the door, her step steady, and emerged into the pale morning light, standing beside him. A murmur went through the posse. Barrow's eyes widened in triumph. "There she is. Sheriff, do your duty." Before the sheriff could speak, Alara found her voice. It was not loud, but it was clear and carried in the still air. "Your claim, Mr. Barrow, was on a farm that would have been profitable if not for the blight you sold my husband in that sack of seed corn." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Barrow's face went from purple to a pasty white. "That's a lie. A desperate slander." "Is it?" Alara continued, her confidence growing. "I still have the sack. And I remember Mr. Abernathy and Mr. Gable buying the same seed from you, and their crops failing in the exact same way. They lost their land to you as well, didn't they? Is that your business model, Mr. Barrow? Selling ruin, then buying the wreckage for pennies on the dollar?" The sheriff looked from Alara to Barrow, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The other men from town shifted, their expressions no longer so certain. They all knew of Abernathy's and Gable's troubles. "This is nonsense," Barrow blustered. "She's hysterical." "I'm not," Alara said calmly. "I am a witness." Silas raised his rifle, the motion fluid and economical. He didn't point it at anyone, but the gesture was clear. The line had been drawn. "You've heard the lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now get off my land." The sheriff, a man who understood the difference between a legal document and the hard reality of a determined man with a rifle, made his decision. He looked at Barrow with undisguised distaste. "This is a civil matter, Barrow, not a lawman's. You settle it with the circuit judge, not with hired guns." He turned his horse. "Let's go, boys." Barrow stared, his mouth working silently. His authority had evaporated. Defeated and humiliated, he and his men wheeled their horses and retreated, their departure far less grand than their arrival. The clearing was quiet again, save for the whisper of the wind in the pines. Alara stood beside Silas on the porch, the tension slowly draining from her body, leaving a clean, stark strength in its place. She had not been rescued. She had stood and fought with the only weapon she had, the truth. He lowered the rifle. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the spot where the men had disappeared. The shared danger, the shared victory, had forged something new between them, something stronger than the unspoken barter of survival. It was a partnership. He finally turned and went back inside. She followed. The air in the cabin felt different, lighter. The ghosts were gone. He stoked the fire, then put the kettle on. He moved to the table and picked up a small block of wood and a knife, and began to carve, his hands sure and steady. Alara watched him, her heart full of a quiet, fierce gratitude. The filth she had confessed was not hers. It was the town's, it was Barrow's. The winter had scoured it away, and this silent man had given her the shelter to heal. He had seen the wound, not the dirt. He finished his small carving and held it out to her. It was a bird, roughly shaped but unmistakable, its wings slightly lifted as if about to take flight. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The wood was warm. No words were needed. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, a new life was beginning. It would be a hard life, a life of work and winter, but it would be theirs. And for the first time since she could remember, Alara felt clean. She felt free.